Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Commissioner Bob Ott, and I represent the area where the Sterigenics plant is located. I want to welcome you all, and I want to thank you for being concerned and involved with your community. What I'd like to do before I turn it over to the moderator, we have a lot of your elected representatives here to hear the presentation tonight. I would just like to let you know who's here. Congressman Scott is here. You all can just raise your hand if you want. Congresswoman McBath. Representative Claire Bartlett from Congressman Loudermilk's office. State Senator Jen Jordan. State Senator Kay Kirkpatrick. State Representative Eric Allen. State Representative Sheila Jones. State Representative Terry Nolowitz. State Representative Sharon Cooper. State Representative Mary Frances Williams. The Honorable Kimberly Childs from the Superior Court. Mayor Max Bacon and the Smyrna City Council will be here shortly. They had a council meeting tonight. Also coming will be Smyrna Councilmember Derek Norton, Councilmember Tim Gould, Councilmember Susan Wilkerson, Councilmember Andrea Bluestein, Marilyn Blackburn, Charles Welch, and Ron Fennell. Cobb County Commission Chairman Mike Boyce, Cobb Commissioner Joanne Burrell, Cobb Commissioner Lisa Cupid, Fulton County Commission Chair Rob Pitts, Atlanta City Council Member Dustin Hillis, Atlanta City Council Member J.P. Matsakite. I think I got it right. School Board Member for Cobb County David Chastain, School Board Member Charisse Davis, and School Board Member Jaha Howard. Also, we have the Chief Operating Officer to Governor Kemp, Lori Smith, the Deputy Chief Operating Officer to Governor Kemp, Cody Whitlock, Policy Advisor to Governor Kemp, Josh Hildebrandt, Cobb County Manager Rob Hosack, and Cobb County School Chief of Staff Kevin Daniel. Okay, City of Atlanta Council President Felicia Moore. And before I turn it over to the moderator, I just want to remind everyone we have a lot of folks in here that came to get information. And so I would ask that everyone be respectful of the speakers. Shouting out does not help the situation. Everyone just needs to listen to the presentations for the information that these folks have come to present. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Ott. My name is Toby Berkman. I am a facilitator. I work for a nonprofit organization called the Consensus Building Institute, and essentially we help facilitate meetings around difficult public issues. The important thing for you all to know just about who I am, though, is that I am not with EPA. I'm not affiliated with any state or federal agency. I'm essentially an independent, neutral party here. And my role is basically to help manage this meeting, to help make sure we stay on time, to help make sure your questions are answered, and most importantly, to help make sure that you all know about how you can continue to stay engaged moving forward. So I just want to say that I know there are a lot of folks in the audience here who are not happy about what's been going on. There's folks who are angry, folks who are concerned about the well-being of their families, of their children, their loved ones, and you want to know answers about what's been going on, why, and what's going to happen. So my hope is today that we can give you some of those answers. We have folks from various agencies up here ready to give you information, try to answer as many of your questions as you can. And my most important hope for this meeting is that this can be the beginning, that we can open up a space for ongoing dialogue between you and your government officials. So I just want to go over a few of the meeting objectives for today, so you know what we're really here to try to accomplish. So first is we want to provide timely and accurate information on ethylene oxide, what has happened to date, and plans moving forward. We also want to answer your most pressing questions. And then finally, we want to make sure you all are informed about next steps and opportunities for future input. So here's how the evening is going to go. In a few minutes, I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues to my right, who are going to offer some welcoming remarks on behalf of EPA, on behalf of the state, and on behalf of some community groups. Then we're going to have a series of panels. We're going to have one panel that's focused on past and current knowledge of ethylene oxide and the Sterigenics facility. That's really going to be focused on, what happened, why, and what's going on now. Then after that, we're going to have a period of questions and answers, and I'm going to talk in a minute about how that's going to work. And then we'll go on to another panel, and this next panel is going to be focused on health information, trying to provide you all the most up-to-date, best health information we can on what ethylene oxide does. Again, we'll have presentations followed by some Q&A. Then we're going to hear briefly about some next steps for the agencies involved, and then wrap up and adjourn by 9 o'clock. So in terms of your role today, this is an informational meeting, right? So as I said, the purpose is to be conveying some information to you. This is not, for tonight at least, the forum for public comment or open mic. We're going to engage the presenters with questions that were submitted by the community in advance. And so these were submitted on the EPA website. During today's open house, we also had some questions that were submitted. And we just so you know, we've checked in with some of the community groups that have been involved and just made sure we're asking the questions that are most important to you all. So I'm going to be essentially reading the questions on behalf of the community today. And I know there are some folks who really wanted there to be an open mic, wanted to have community representatives up here. I just want to acknowledge that. We're doing it this way because it's really the best way we could think about to try to get you as much information, the best information as we can. And I just want to emphasize again, although this is an information sharing meeting, EPA and the state, they plan to continue to engage with the community and offer future opportunities for dialogue. So that's coming, if that's what you want. I just want to briefly go over a few ground rules to make sure we're all on the same page. So you as the audience, pretty straightforward. Just want you to please allow the speakers to present and answer questions. And that's just really out of respect for fellow members of the community that submitted questions that want to get answers. We want to get to as many questions as we can tonight. Speakers, I'm going to ask the speakers to please stay within the time limits that we've talked about. Please try to focus your remarks on the community's concerns, and please try to answer those questions succinctly so we can get to as many as we possibly can. Just so you know, a lot of you submitted questions. There's no way we can get to all of those tonight. We got a ton of questions, which is fantastic. Shows the amount of interest and concern out there. We're going to get to as many as we can, and if we can't get to a question, we're going to be posting answers to those in a free FAQ on the EPA website. We're going to talk more about that, but y'all can stay tuned. The plan is to get answers to every possible question we can. Okay. So with that, enough introductions. I'm going to now turn it over to folks to my right here to offer some additional opening remarks. So first, we're very pleased to welcome the U.S. EPA Region 4 Administrator, Mary Walker. Thanks, Mary. Come on up.
Hi, good evening. Once again, my name is Mary Walker, and I'm the Regional Administrator for EPA Region 4. We're based right here in Atlanta. I'd like to first thank Commissioner Bob Ott for hosting us here at the Cobb County Civic Center tonight. And I'd like to thank you all for joining us here tonight. I know you're here because you have questions and you're concerned about ethylene oxide in your area. EPA and Georgia EPD have been working on this issue together, and we're here because we know you're concerned and we want to answer your questions. So as we work together to put tonight's forum together, we got tremendous support from our sister state and federal agencies, as well as academic and community partners. And I'd like to acknowledge the following agencies and groups for being part of our work here tonight on our forum: the Georgia Environmental Protection Division, the Georgia Department of Public Health, the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, ATSDR, the Region 4 Southeast Environmental Health Specialty Unit out of Emory University, and the many community partners that we've worked with. Thank you all. I'd also like to once again recognize the elected officials at the local, state, and federal levels who've engaged with us on this issue. I know Commissioner Ott has acknowledged you all, but I'd like to thank you again for your engagement and your leadership. We very much appreciate it. So we have a lot of information to share with you all tonight, and we want to make sure we have the maximum amount of time to answer your questions. So I'll keep my remarks short. But as we start out tonight, I really want to highlight that a core part of the work that we do at EPA is continually looking into the environment, working to improve our science so that we can better understand what we see as it relates to human health and as it relates to environmental quality. When we see something that flags as a potential issue for us, we look to understand more, and we look for ways to address it. And so that's what the National Air Toxics Assessment, the NATO report, is. It is the first step of this process. It's a high-level screening tool that gives us nationally a high-level look at air quality in the country so that we can see if there's anything that needs to be looked into further. In the most recent NATA, as you all know, ethylene oxide was flagged as a pollutant of potential concern in a number of areas around the country. And since that time, EPA has been working to address this on two fronts. First, at the federal level, we're reviewing our regulations for facilities that emit ethylene oxide to ensure that they are protective. We're currently reviewing and plan to update two standards: our standards for commercial sterilizers, such as the Sterigenics facility, and our standards for certain chemical manufacturers which emit ethylene oxide. We will propose update to these rules in the near future. We're also looking to better understand ethylene oxide in the environment more broadly. At the same time, our second area of focus, and this is an area where we're working in partnership with states, is for those areas where the NATA report indicated that there may be a higher risk. We've worked with our state partners to drill down to get better and more information that is updated and that's localized to the specific facility and its surroundings, and then take steps to address them if needed. And so that's what brings us here tonight. Since the NATA report was issued, EPA and Georgia EPD have been working together to better understand Sterigenics emissions, what those emissions may mean for the surrounding community, and to ensure that any unacceptable risks are addressed. Through this work, we have learned that between 2014 and 2017, the Sterigenics facility in Smyrna has added controls that have reduced ethylene oxide emissions by over 90% from the emissions that were used in the NATA report. As we've reviewed Georgia's refined modeling that uses those more recent emissions data, we see that in residential areas surrounding the facility, the emissions from Sterigenics are within the range that the Clean Air Act directs us to when evaluating safety. We understand that you have questions about this, and we will have panelists here tonight that can provide you more information and answer your questions about current risk levels. Finally, to drive emissions down even further, Georgia EPD has entered into a binding agreement with the company to install additional controls that will add a further level of safety. We look forward to talking to you about all this tonight. We brought a number of experts here to talk about the air pollution control work that is underway, as well as health professionals to answer your questions about ethylene oxide. We're committed as this process moves forward to making sure that your air quality is protected and to engaging with you in the process. I want to assure you that we take even the possibility that there are harmful levels of any chemical in your air, in our air, very seriously. We're committed to ensuring your safety, to working with you openly and transparently, to answering your questions, to listening to your input, and to continuing to communicate with you going forward. Again, thank you so much for being here tonight and for your interest and your participation. And I'm now going to turn this over to Rick Dunn, Director of Georgia's Environmental Protection Division.
Thank you, Mary, and good evening. We have a pretty tight timekeeper here, so I want to jump. I wanted to make 3 points, but I'll probably narrow it to 2, and hopefully we can address the other one in the panels. The first point I want to make, and this kind of reemphasize what Mary just talked about a second ago, is our understanding of the level of public exposure to ethylene oxide emitted from the operations of these medical device sterilization firms. As we know, NATA, as Mary just said, NATA was a very high-level screening tool. It was very clear as a screening tool that its results should not be used to pinpoint exposure to air toxics at particular places like neighborhoods, churches, schools, or businesses. The reason why NADA could not pinpoint those specific risks is because at the national level, it lacked the needed data. The NADA estimates for exposure to air concentrations are presented as an average for the entire census tract. We know, even at the small census tract level, we expect exposure to pollutants such as ethylene oxide to vary greatly. There'll be some areas in that census tract where the exposure is high, much higher than an average number, and there'll be areas of a census tract where the exposure is less, much less than those numbers presented in the report. When your concern is possibly excessive exposure health risks, this level of precision in the NADA report is not sufficient nor very helpful. We need to be able to isolate areas or spots of concern. To pinpoint areas where exposure may be present at unacceptable levels and pose excessive cancer risk, you need detailed local information such as current emissions, location of residential areas or other receptors, meteorology, topography, etc., etc. So our first step when the report came out was to actually take that local data and model dispersion of ethylene oxide emissions using this information. Our process was completed in June. I need to be quick to get to my second point, but the maps that are a result of that modeling process are here tonight, and I hope that you've had a chance to see them. Inside the red circle, that's the area where there is risk that meet the EPA excessive risk threshold. Outside of that area, there are concerning levels, but it doesn't rise to the same level. So instead of talking about a census block, we need to look at that map and understand where the risks really are. Let me just try to make a second point, and again, I'll ignore the third point. Although there's very small areas that exceed EPA's excessive risk threshold, these areas, the concentrations in some of these areas are still of deep concern. What's in the red circle, those edges of the red circle, the risks are high and no longer fall within the state of Georgia's margin of safety Georgia considers appropriate for hazardous air pollutants. It deserves attention, and it particularly deserves attention because there's actions these companies can do to further reduce emissions and lower risk. This is my second point. We believe that the quickest and most effective way to reduce ethylene oxide emissions from these facilities and to lower the risk is to seek voluntary additional emission controls. When I say voluntary additional emission controls, I don't mean just do whatever you think you can. We refer to a very structured process. And the end result of that process will be a new permit for the facility with new emission limits based upon the equipment design of the new controls the company has agreed to install. The new permit will also require demonstration of expected emission reductions through regular performance testing of controls. For Sterigenics, we expect the new controls to be installed no later than January, but hopefully earlier. The modeled emissions from these controls will reduce emissions significantly, well below the thresholds instituted by the EPA, well below the thresholds we at the state of Georgia considers appropriate. I will end there. I appreciate your time. I appreciate you listening. I look forward to the panel discussion and hearing your questions and concerns. Thank you. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. So I'm Janet Rao, for those of you who don't know me. This is Leonard Robinson. Leonard's with Sustainable Smyrna. I have found myself in the enviable position of being the president of Stop Sterigenics Georgia. I am so heartened to see all of you here, that you have taken your personal time to come to learn more, to be informed about your community. That's where we as citizens have to be. We need to be involved with these kinds of discussions to make sure that there is always transparency for us, that we always understand what is in our air, what is in our neighborhood, what our children are eating and drinking. So We're also very grateful for all of our elected officials who are here tonight. We thank you. We take note of those who didn't come. And we want to make sure that we as a group continue to represent the entire impacted area, not just here in Atlanta, but also our friends over in the Covington-Newton area. We've got another organization over in Augusta that's in the process of forming. So, you know, this is a statewide issue. It's important that the governor has representatives here so that they are taking back to him the feeling of our community. We provided those signs to you so that you can raise them, get your emotions out that way, try to be as quiet as possible so that we can get as many questions as we possibly can. Toby, our moderator, is going to do a great job reading the questions, providing follow-ups, and making sure that he is channeling your voices through the questions that you submitted. So thank you all very, very much. Let Leonard talk.
Thank you, Janet. I just made a new best friend with Janet. My name is Leonard Robinson from Sustainable Smyrna. You know, I moved out here a couple of years ago to retire, and you know what I found out just a couple of weeks ago? I got a coal ash plant in my front yard. I got Sterigenics in my backyard. You know, I just found out in the newspaper, and I'm an environmental professional, I just found out. So I'm wondering, what I'd like is, you know, half my objectives here. We've got our elected officials, we've got federal and state here, we've got everybody together. 50% of winning is showing up. We have everybody here. So let's get some things done. But also, I'm getting too old to do this one plan at a time. Let's find out everything that we have. Let's do a holistic to see what's in our neighborhood so we can make informed choices of our. So, you know, I appreciate the time to come and speak. I appreciate everybody taking time out of your schedule. Me, I would rather be at a barbecue, wouldn't you? But we got to do what we got to do because this is the government of the people, by the people, and for the people, and we're the people. So let's keep moving forward. Remember, you can make it happen, you can watch it happen, or you're going to wonder, what happened? Thank you very much.
Thanks so much to our first panelists. So if we could invite the first group of panelists to come on up for our panel number one. Please come have a seat up here on the stage. So I'm going to introduce these panelists here. So this is our first panel. This is on the past and current knowledge of ethylene oxide and the facilities. So really this is about, you know, what did we know in the past? What did we learn? What do we know now? What's going on with ethylene oxide and what's going on with this facility? Right, so trying to get a sense of that history and trying to get a sense of where we are now. So we're going to hear an overview of NADA from Kelly Reimer, who's with the US EPA, the Office of Air Quality Planning and Standards. Then we're going to hear from Ken Mitchell, also from US EPA, but from here in the region, from the Air and Radiation Division. And then we're going to hear from Karen Hayes, the Georgia EPA Air Protection Branch. And she's going to talk about refined analysis for the Sterigenics facility. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kelly. Kelly, just use this and press forward.
Thank you, Toby. And thank you, everybody, for coming out tonight. Tonight, I'm going to talk to you very briefly about how we at EPA discovered that ethylene oxide might be an issue that needs to be worked on more, investigated more in this area. Every few years, EPA does a large nationwide study called the National Air Toxics Study. We look at 180 pollutants that come from industrial facilities and cars and trucks, and we use a computer model to move those pollutants around and estimate how much of these pollutants we're breathing. We combine that with the knowledge of how toxic these pollutants are for us, and we end up with a risk. What's somebody's chance of getting sick from breathing these pollutants? Now, as was mentioned before, this is a very high-level assessment, and its purpose is to tell us where to look further. And when we did the last assessment, we determined that several areas of the country, including in the Atlanta area, there needs to be more work to understand what really is the risk to people, and mostly we're talking about ethylene oxide in this case. So there are a couple of notes about the assessment. First of all, we use the latest information that we have on the emissions, or what's coming out of the facilities, the pollutants that are being emitted from the facilities. We do that by doing a nationwide look at the emissions every 3 years. The latest one is from 2014. So that's a little bit old at this point, but it's still good enough to give us an idea of where to look. But it's important that if we find something, that we look further. The second thing that's important to point out is that science marches forward, and our understanding of how toxic a pollutant is to our bodies marches forward as well. And recently, the new studies about the chemical ethylene oxide tells us that it's more potent than science previously understood. So this is the first time in the National Air Toxics Assessment that we've seen ethylene oxide be a chemical that we need to be concerned about. Before, we've done NATA since the 1990s, and ethylene oxide hasn't come up before. But because we have a better understanding of how that it's more toxic than it used to be, or a better understanding of how toxic it really is, that way, that's how it came to be. So just to give you some perspective, this is the national map, of course, and this is showing that NATA's average cancer risk is 30 in a million. Now, very few people's risk is 30 in a million because that's an average. Some are higher, some are lower. But you can see in, I don't think this is going to reach that far, but you can see in Georgia, I'm sure everybody's looking at Georgia just like I am, you can see there's a few spots that are a little bit darker blue, and those are the areas that we're looking into right now. I'm going to zoom in a little bit on those, and so you can see those areas. It's another area up in West Virginia, and there's some areas in a couple of the other states there you can see as well. But we're talking about the Atlanta area right now and today. So what we found in the Atlanta area, and again, this is what we call a screening estimate. So it's a high-level study. It tells us where to look further. It can't tell us what our risks exactly are. But when we see risks around greater than 100 in a million, and most of that's from ethylene oxide, we really need to look into it. And that's exactly what Georgia is doing, and they're going to be talking to you about that very soon. So what this 100 in a million number means, it's generally the upper end of what we think is acceptable. We live in an industrial society. The Clean Air Act says facilities can emit some pollution into the air, but there are limits to what they can do, and those limits are based on what's good for us in terms of our health. So 100 in a million is not a regulation, it's not a regulatory action level. It's a level that we begin to really look closely and say, hey, we need to see if there's something going on in these areas. And again, that's what Georgia's doing right now. What EPA is doing right now, as was mentioned before by Mary, is that we are reviewing all of our regulations that have to do with ethylene oxide, including regulations that are for the commercial sterilizer industry. And we're going to be proposing rules as soon as we can on those. How those rules look, what those rules do is they tell the industry how much they can emit out of their facility. We don't set levels in the outside air to breathe. That's what we do for ozone. You're probably familiar with ozone or particulate matter, where we have national ambient air levels is what we call them. For these air toxics pollutants, what we do is we tell the facility themselves, this is how much you guys can emit. So when you see the rules coming out, you can understand that that's what those rules are going to do. They're going to tell these facilities how much of their air pollution they can emit. In addition to reviewing the rules, we're getting information on ethylene oxide. We're working with state air agencies all over the country, including in Georgia, to get a better understanding of what emissions are from ethylene oxide. We're focusing first on the areas that NATA is talking to us about and telling us about. And Georgia, again, was going to update you on that work. And we're learning a lot more about ethylene oxide every day. So what we're doing then is sometimes we're going to wait for that regulation, and sometimes we may need to take action before we put out a regulation to protect public health. So that's my brief remarks. If you have, these slides will be available on the web, and there are a couple of websites if you're interested in going to and learning more about the National Air Toxics Assessment. So thank you very much. I turn it back to you. I'm going to turn it over to Ken.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Ken Mitchell. I'm with EPA Region 4 here in Atlanta, and I also want to thank you all for taking time out of your evening to come and talk with us about ethylene oxide in the Smyrna area. So just after me, I'm going to be very brief because just after me, Karen Hayes from Georgia EPD is going to come up and talk about some of the work that they've been doing to better understand ethylene oxide emissions at the Sterigenics facility. But before she comes up, I thought I would go through a couple of topics that I know that many of you have heard about or have asked about, but it's not the kind of stuff that you may work with in your daily lives. Unless you're an environmental scientist or something, you may not know about some of these things, but they're kind of integral to the conversation that we're going to have tonight. So I thought I'd just take a minute and make sure that we all have a basic understanding of some of the tools that we're using to try and understand ethylene oxide as we move through this process. And so the first thing is monitoring for ethylene oxide. So there's two, you can think of monitoring broadly in two different scenarios. In the first scenario, monitoring means to take a sample, to take an actual sample, and you can do that inside the facility, and that's actually done for a lot of different reasons. So one would be to show compliance with environmental regulations. If EPA or EPD has a law that says you have to reduce your emissions by so much, they may have to do some testing or monitoring in the facility to show compliance with those rules. Another reason would be to monitor the air to make sure that the people who work in the facility are safe. So those rules are implemented by not EPA, but by OSHA, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with. So they may do monitoring in the facility for that. And a third reason that you may do monitoring in the facility is to gather some of the detailed information that you might need to do improved computer-generated estimates of ethylene oxide in outdoor air. So the NADA analysis relies a lot on computer modeling. Georgia EPD has done some additional computer modeling. So I just wanted to make sure that you all knew that we, when we can, we get better information about facility emissions by doing tests at the facility and then using that to generate better emissions estimates. But then you can also monitor for ethylene oxide in outdoor air. And so there's a number of reasons why you might want to do that. You could put a sampler up, and if you were outside earlier, you may have seen somebody walking around with what looked like a big silver basketball. That's the device that we use to collect samples of air and then take them to the laboratory and measure them for different chemicals, including ethylene oxide. So that's called a canister sampler. And so as opposed to the computer, which just estimates the concentration of ethylene oxide in outdoor air, the monitor, the canister monitor, collects actual samples and tells you what is in the air at a given place at a given time. But just knowing that when you take that sample, it's going to collect whatever is blowing by it at that time, right? So if the wind is blowing from Sterigenics, you might capture ethylene oxide in the sample. If it's blowing from somewhere else that has ethylene oxide in it, you would also capture that in the sample. So, so there are pluses and minuses to both monitoring and modeling, and I'll tell you a few more of them as we go through this. So each sample concentration will reflect the influence of all those different sources. And so what I wanted to really help folks understand is that when we talk about ethylene oxide concentrations at the levels we think are out there in the Smyrna area from Sterigenics. Those are relatively low levels, and so what we're concerned about from a public health standpoint are chronic exposures that may result in long-term health problems, as opposed to acute, really high-level concentrations that may come by. So we're talking about, when we talk about taking samples to understand that long-term low-level exposure, if you take just a few samples here and there, it won't answer that question. You have to take a number of samples over a longer period of time so that you understand how the concentrations change with time, with the seasons, with different weather patterns, and so on and so forth. So a few samples, they'll provide some information, but they may not answer the question, what is my long-term risk? And just to point out, a lot of what we'll talk about tonight is what the law requires and allows. And the current regulations for Sterigenics and other commercial sterilizers do not require, there's no legal requirement for them to do monitoring beyond their facility fence line. So I know people have questions about that, but I just wanted to make sure everybody understood that that's what the law currently allows. So when you collect these samples, you don't get an answer right away, typically. You have to take that sample and send it to a laboratory, and a specialized laboratory at that, because it's a little bit of a difficult chemical to analyze for in the laboratory, and there aren't a lot of labs that have really solid, good experience yet with looking for ethylene oxide. So you find one of those labs, you send the sample to the lab, and then they have to evaluate it to figure out what's in it. So this is, I only say this because it takes a minute to do these kinds of studies and get these kinds of results. And so that's monitoring. So modeling is a little different. I've mentioned it a couple of times. So what this is basically, a model is basically using a computer to generate estimates of what is in the air downwind from a facility that is emitting a chemical. And so this is frequently used. It's the basis of the NADA analysis. Karen Hayes from Georgia EPD is going to talk about their modeling study. And it uses the emissions estimates from the facility. You may need to know some of the chemical specific properties of the thing that's being emitted. You need to know which way the wind's blowing on which days. You need to have an understanding of meteorology. And then also the topography of the area around the facility. Is it flat? Does it sit on top of a mountain? Does it sit at the bottom of a mountain? There's a lot of stuff that you have to know to put into a model to get an answer about what's in the air downwind from the facility. But the nice thing about models, there's one of the positives about models is that you can use this information to fairly quickly come up with estimates of air concentrations of a chemical from a facility fairly quickly. So unlike monitoring studies, which can take months or more than months, modeling studies can typically be done fairly quickly if you have the input information that you need. So I say all that because as we move forward here, people are going to want monitoring. Some people are going to want modeling. There'll probably be some of both, and both have pluses and minuses, and both of them together can give you pieces of information that you can use to help understand what's in the air and what it may mean. And the last thing I wanted to say is that one of the surprising things that's happened as we've started looking at ethylene oxide around the country is in several places in a number of states, people have started taking samples for ethylene oxide and looking at them. And one of the surprising things that we found is that in many places around the country, it appears that there's ethylene oxide in places where you wouldn't expect to find it necessarily, not near any known source of ethylene oxide. So we're trying to understand that. We have a lot of folks now who are intently working on trying to figure out why are we finding ethylene oxide in samples where we didn't expect to find it. And I tell you that because as the monitoring studies that are being planned for the Smyrna area go forward, you may find ethylene oxide in some of these samples at levels that may be higher than you expect. They may be in places where you don't expect to find it. So just so you know, in some of these samples around the country, we're finding what we're calling background levels, just kind of typical what you would find, even though there may not be a source nearby, of 0.1 to 0.3 micrograms of ethylene oxide in a cubic meter of air. That's how we express concentration. And a sample was recently taken at a South DeKalb monitoring station operated by Georgia EPD, and they found 0.31 micrograms of ethylene oxide in that sample. So that's about what we're finding in these background samples from around the country. And there's no known source of ethylene oxide near that monitor. So I just say that so that all of us can go into this with our eyes wide open, that ethylene oxide may be a not uncommon chemical out in our air, and there are sources that we know, there may be sources that we don't know, and we're trying to understand that better right now. So with that, I hope that helps you as I turn this over to Karen Hayes to talk about some of her monitoring and modeling efforts.
Drop this down a little bit. Well, thank you all for coming. I appreciate you taking the time to come and listen and learn about what's been going on here. So when the NADA was released last year, 2018, Georgia EPD reviewed the NADA results and contacted the facilities that we knew emitted ethylene oxide in the state. One was the Sterigenics facility in Cobb County. There was a BD facility in Covington and Madison, KPR in Augusta, Sterilization Services in Fulton County, and then Stepan in Winder. The last one is actually a chemical manufacturer. The rest are commercial sterilizers using ethylene oxide to sterilize medical equipment. So we specifically honed on the two facilities that were in the census tract with that showed potentially elevated cancer risk levels from the NADA. So we began talking with Sterigenics and BD Covington to get updated emissions information, because we knew, especially in the case of Sterigenics, they had reduced their emissions significantly in 2016 after that 2014 data used in the NADA. So we requested the information on the emissions as well as characteristics of the building and the facility. So how much goes out this stack? How much goes out this roof vent? Where is the boundary line, the property line for the facility? All that kind of information goes into this refined modeling analysis that we are doing. And we're not looking at the census tract at this point now. We're honing in on the nearest residents, who lives close to the facilities, where are the houses, where are the businesses, all of that, where are the streets, and did that modeling analysis. So we got all the information that we needed from the facilities by May of this year, and by June of this year, the modeling memos were completed. So we gave them both to the facilities that we modeled as well as USEPA because we wanted to make sure we're all in agreement with regard to the risk analysis. And as you heard before, EPA said the risk, according to Clean Air Act criteria, is within the acceptable range. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the modeling. and is the best way to begin this process of understanding the impact of one specific facility and one specific pollutant on the areas. Is it perfect? No, but it is a useful tool. It is really helpful, especially to model any changes in emissions as well, and the concentrations at the nearby residences. So at the same time we're doing this modeling analysis, the risk is less than what was suggested in the National Air Toxic Assessment, again within EPA's acceptable range. However, EPD determined that the additional controls from the facilities were necessary because we have some permitting guidance that we use that takes a much more stringent approach to emissions. So we looked at the concentration that we're modeling, determined that additional controls were needed, and we worked with the facilities on strategies to do additional controls. We specifically focused on fugitive emissions because based on the information we got from our models, we could tell that the fugitive emissions, the emissions that were not going out of the stack, were driving the risk. And as Director Dunn mentioned, we did seek these controls through voluntary means because this was the quickest way to achieve the emission reductions. We didn't want to wait for EPA to revise the federal regulation. So in July of this year, both BD Covington and Sterigenics announced that they're going to install additional controls to reduce emissions. And in late July, Sterigenics submitted their permit application to install additional controls. And I heard that last Friday they received the building permit to proceed with that project. So they're going to route all indoor air, the fugitive emissions in other words, through a control device before it exits the building, basically pulling a vacuum on the whole facility. And those emissions will be routed through a dry bed system, a absorber type system to capture those emissions before that source is discharged out of stack. They're also adding some secondary control device to further reduce the emissions from their sterilization chambers and their aeration chambers. They will drop the emissions significantly down to around 40 pounds a year, which is very low. Then on August 7th of this year, EPD executed a consent order with the company, basically making this voluntary agreement enforceable, giving them deadlines to commence construction, complete construction, and operate the equipment. In the meantime, we're processing that permit application. The permit application is available on our website. If you want to submit comments, you can submit comments on our website to the Ask EPD link, and we expect to issue that permit in 4 to 6 weeks. So a lot of questions about monitoring, both monitoring the facility, self-reporting issues, and then also monitoring in the ambient air. So when we go to we do monitor the facility through unannounced on-site inspections. They have to do stack tests or performance tests to demonstrate the effectiveness of the control equipment. And those results are audited by us. The results are analyzed by certified labs, and the tests are typically done by a third-party stack test team. They're also required to keep a lot of records on the proper operation of the air control devices, such as the temperature, the flow rate, on the scrubber, things of that nature. And when our inspector goes on site, they're checking all that information. So another monitoring that you're talking about is air quality monitoring outside the facility in the neighborhoods. And we have not done we haven't done any ethylene oxide monitoring until June of this year. But in June, we took our first monitoring sample at what we call our South to Cab monitoring site. And we took it here because we already had the setup needed to take the sample. And also that we wanted to get some baseline information before we moved in towards the facilities. As Ken just mentioned, that sample was 0.31 micrograms per cubic meter. Higher than we would have expected, but as Ken also said, based on information from other states who have now started monitoring, it is in the range of what they are seeing as well, and obviously a lot more needs to be known about where that ethylene oxide is coming from. And so we took 3 additional samples last week as well, and they're being analyzed right now. And we are also have developed a monitoring plan, which we announced last Friday, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, I think, in panel number 3. So thank you for your time.
Okay, thanks so much to our panelists. So we're now going to do some questions and answers. And again, these are questions that were submitted either online through the EPA website or up in the town hall up there, and we also spoke with some community groups about these. So I'm going to be reading these and turning to you folks for some answers. So first question, and I'm just going to read this. We are extremely upset and disappointed to learn of the elevated levels of ethylene oxide documented in our region well over a year ago. Why wasn't our area informed of this increased risk? We had to learn it through a WebMD article. We have also learned that independent air testing is not being performed by the EPA to check the actual exposure. Are we to assume the chemical company that was shut down and sued in Illinois for exceeding amounts of carcinogen, leading to unknown risks to lives, is going to be honest with self-reporting? We have 2 small children and would like answers. Please advise where we turn to help, if not for folks at the EPA. So this is, I think, a question really about why was this information not made available earlier. So there have been events going on in Illinois. There have also been, in 2016 was when the information with the NADA assessment was first known and communities were not notified. So folks want to know why not.
Okay. Well, this is, let me start and I'll turn it over to Karen and see if she has something to add. So as Kelly mentioned, and it was mentioned earlier, the NADA analysis is a screening level analysis. As Kelly described how it's designed and developed, the way I think about it is I think of like going across the country in an airplane, and I look out the window at 30,000 feet and I see the ground way below me, and I see something that looks like a blob or a spot or something that doesn't look quite right, but all I know is that it doesn't look quite right. I don't really know if it's a problem or not. I need to land the plane, go to that place, and get some. I'm getting there. I'm getting there. You have to go to that place to figure out if there really is a problem. And so when we do these kinds of studies and release this kind of information, we have to ask ourselves the question, what's the best way to tell folks about information and when, so that we
Folks,
provide
please let them
them with
speak.
so that we provide them with useful information as soon as possible. And so I will say that through this experience with ethylene oxide here in Georgia, I've learned some stuff, and I've been working on this for a long time. So I think as we go forward, we've learned from you that we need to think deeply about how and when we release the NADA data and how we talk about it to folks. So do we tell you about a screening analysis soon? And actually, it was on a website, but we didn't come to you to tell you about it. Or do we wait until we have a much better, stronger, more thorough answer to give you? So we appreciate this comment. We're going to go back and learn from it and figure out how we can communicate better with folks going forward on the NADA analysis. But I will say that now that we're here with where we are now, and we have a better understanding of the Sterigenics facility, and we are having this meeting and talking with folks, that we are committed to having a strong conversation with you going forward, to hear your questions, your concerns, to discuss this with you and provide as up-to-date information as we can. And again, like I said, going forward, the next time the NADA comes out, we will be much more thoughtful about how we how and when we provide information to communities.
Thanks, Ken. Karen, please go ahead.
Well, first, I hear you. I hear that you feel like we should have talked to you long before that. I hear it. So our focus, right or wrong, was taking the NADA results and trying to figure out what was actually happening on the ground through the strategy I talked about before. So we wanted an answer. How high was the risk? And what we found was, although the risk was higher than we would want in Georgia, it was what EPA would consider acceptable. We were completing that project when the WebMD article was released.
Thanks. Next question, and this was definitely a theme that came up. Why should this plant be able to operate in an area so clearly surrounded by residential neighborhoods that include not only homes, but multiple schools? Any level of this compound is unacceptable with so many people living so close, nevertheless above safe levels. Also, we hear only about Cobb County. Most of the adjoining neighborhoods are in Fulton. So, question around why is this plant not being shut down, and what about Fulton County?
Okay, I'll take a stab at that. So the Environmental Protection Agency, we operate under the laws that Congress gives us, and the law that we have to work with here for this type of issue is the Clean Air Act. And the Clean Air Act is structured in a way that it does allow small amounts of pollution to be emitted, but gives the EPA the charge to try and minimize those emissions down to safe levels. So it doesn't say that the emissions have to be zero. It says, because in many cases that's just not technologically possible. We don't know how to do that. And in an industrialized society, the Clean Air Act takes this balancing act approach where it says you can have some pollution emitted, but you need to minimize those emissions to the point where people are not in danger. And so this facility, as just one of many, many examples where a facility is given a permit that allows them to pollute, but we try and evaluate those emissions to establish whether they are causing a problem or would cause a problem with the neighbors, no matter who those neighbors are, whether they're kids going to school, people working in neighboring businesses, just anybody. And so it's a bit of a complicated framework, but the way it basically works for ethylene oxide is that the law says that that facilities are allowed to release ethylene oxide, but it shouldn't be over a certain amount. And when we do have releases that are at an acceptable amount, we should also try and find ways to minimize those emissions for as many people as possible. And so we have a rule on the book to minimize emissions from commercial sterilizers like the Sterigenics facility. They're currently meeting those legal requirements, but Karen has and her folks have gone back and looked more closely at those remaining emissions. We've determined at EPA that Karen's analysis indicates that in the residential areas around the facility, that the risks do not exceed our acceptable risk level. And this is established in the law. This is what we're at EPA required to use as our yardstick for determining whether something is too dangerous or not. But the facility has entered into now a legally binding contract, if you will, with the state that they will reduce those emissions even further. So the levels that are in the residential areas are at a level that fall within our acceptable risk range as required by the Clean Air Act. And they're going to get even better for everyone who works and lives around the facility through this legally binding requirement that Georgia EPD has recently entered into with Sterigenics.
Just like to reiterate some of what Ken said, is that this facility is operating in compliance with the requirements of the permits and in compliance with the law. That is why we chose this path to reduce the emissions voluntarily, so that is now an enforceable agreement to get the emissions down as low as possible, as quickly as possible.
Yeah, thanks, Ken and Karen. So a bit of a follow-up question on this, and I think it gets to, you noting that they're in compliance with the law according to the emissions that you're seeing today. And I think a lot of the questions pointed to, how do we know that that's the case? How do we know that actually what's being emitted is what they're saying it's being emitted? And how do we know that the levels in the ambient air aren't above that? So, folks, excuse me, let me get out the actual question, okay? So folks had a lot of questions about the monitoring, right? And what is that going to look like and how can we trust it? So one question was asking, what prevents Sterigenics from slowing down or stopping their daily sterilization operations at the Smyrna facility to emit a lower than normal ethylene oxide volume during the window when independent air quality tests are being performed? A lot of more general questions, but how can we ensure the integrity of this monitoring? And additional questions I'll just point to around kind of the design, right? Why is it only 1 out of every 6 days? Is there going to be continuous monitoring of the stacks? And what about, why is it only between 1/4 mile and 1 mile? So I think there's a lot of interesting kind of clarity around some of these monitoring decisions and making sure that it's really up to par.
Okay. So with regard to monitoring inside the facility, I'll start with that and then go outside the facility. So we do on-site inspections of the facility. One of our compliance engineers will go out there, they'll look at the records that they maintain on site, check the air pollution control equipment, see if everything is lining up, making sense, go through the facility, make sure nothing additional has been added. Sounds like my microphone is ringing. Nothing has changed in the facility, that everything is operating properly. With regard to the stack test, the performance test on the air pollution control device, it's a test plan that is submitted to us for approval. They hire a third-party stack test team to conduct the test. The test is analyzed, the test results are analyzed by a certified lab, and then the tested report is submitted to us to ensure that everything is done properly. But the fundamental issue I think that people are having concerns with is that a lot of environmental regulations, including the air ones, are fundamentally self-reporting programs. A lot of self-reporting with the state and EPA auditing, checking behind the facility. So with regard to the monitoring outside the facility, we've announced that we are going to conduct some monitoring. I think Smyrna is joining with Cobb County and Atlanta to do some monitoring outside the facility as well. We are going to start with sampling at 1/4 mile in upwind, downwind in a 4-quadrant area. We'll do some monitoring also 1/4 mile, 1/2 mile, 1 mile away as well. Based on that information, that stack plan, that test plan will evolve. These samples are collected over a 24-hour period, and they said the day of the week varies. And that's what we're trying to understand, kind of the variability of the emissions as well as different meteorological conditions. We'll be also checking at the facility to see what kind of production they're having during those times. This will go on for months. It will not go on for a month. It will go on for months. It will be a long-term study.
All right, thanks, folks. So there are a number of other questions kind of on these topics. We're going to move on to the health panel for now, okay, but hopefully we'll have some more time to get to additional questions around the monitoring, around what's happening and what's going to happen, and what if monitoring turns out to not go so well and they're very high levels, okay? But we're going to let this panel leave for now. Thank you guys so much. Please give them a round of applause. And we'll welcome up the health panel. Thank you, guys. Okay, so we have 4 speakers now on this next panel that's going to address some of the health issues related to ethylene oxide. We certainly got a lot of questions about people wondering, what is my risk? What's the risk to my family? What can I do to reduce those risks? So we're going to try to get you all some of the best information we know about what ethylene oxide is, what it does to the body, what the risks look like. So to start off with, and I'm just going to introduce all 4 of you, and you can then go through and hand it off to the next person. We're going to start off with Mark Johnson from ATSDR, the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, which is part of the CDC. And he's going to give an overview of the health effects of ethylene oxide. Then we're going to hear from Sherry Drenzek from the Georgia DPH, who's going to talk about the Cancer Registry data analysis. Then we're going to hear from Chris Rustin, also from Georgia DPH, who's going to talk about collaboration between ATSDR and the Georgia Department of Health. Then finally, we're going to turn it over to Dr. Robert Geller to talk about environmental health. And Dr. Geller is from the Pediatric Environmental Health Specialty Unit, and he's going to talk a little bit about who they are as he gives his remarks. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Johnson.
Yeah, thank you for attending the meeting here tonight. So my name is Mark Johnson. I'm the Regional Director for ATSDR Region 5. For those who don't know the federal regional system, we cover the northern Midwest states. So you're probably wondering why someone from Chicago is here to talk to an Atlanta crowd. The reason I was asked to come here is because we've been involved for the past year in the investigation of the Sterigenics facility in Willowbrook, Illinois, as well as other facilities in our area. And so I wanted to reflect both as a consultant to our local officials who are involved in investigating these facilities here, but also to answer your questions and perspectives about our experience in our investigation. A little bit higher? Is that better? Okay, sorry. So I want to give you a little bit of background information about our agency for those of you who don't know who we are. So we're a federal public health agency. We are part of the Department of Health and Human Services. We're administered by CDC. And our priority is to prevent exposures, to assess exposures in the communities to make sure that actions are taken to prevent exposures from occurring. And to do that, we use the best science that's available. We have staff of toxicologists, physicians, modeling experts, environmental health experts to assist us in identifying problems and creating solutions for those. We're very action-focused. Much of what the impact we have in assessing problems is working with regulatory agencies like EPA and state agencies to take those actions needed to address health concerns in communities, to prevent exposures, and also to identify where there are cases of disease in communities that may be the result of that exposure. So some areas that we work on specifically, again, preventing exposure and reducing community exposures to hazardous substances. We do that through our process of health assessments. We released a document last summer that assessed the health risks associated with exposure to ethylene oxide in the Willowbrook facility that Sterigenics operates. And that report then was released to the public, and then we made recommendations and for actions to be taken for Sterigenics to take actions to reduce emissions, but also for EPA to conduct air monitoring at that facility, which was done over the past year. We're science-based. We have a division of toxicology that goes to the literature and then publishes what we call a toxicological profile. We are in the process of updating that for ethylene oxide. That will be released later this year. That will be a comprehensive summary of what we know about the toxicity and health effects of exposure to ethylene oxide that will be available to the public. Another aspect of what we work on is educating the public, but also specifically healthcare providers in communities, because they can also be a valuable resource to communities and a trusted source of information to their patients. And Dr. Geller will talk a bit more about his role in that process of our health education processes. We've done that kind of outreach to the Willowbrook community, to physicians in that area, but also to other areas of Chicago where we're conducting similar investigations. Some properties about ethylene oxide. It's a gas at ambient temperatures, and so it's really inhalation of ethylene oxide that's the primary pathway of exposure and are concerned about in communities where it's been released. It's colorless and tasteless, and it has a very, what we call a high odor threshold, which means on the order of 500 parts per million, which is way above what you would even see in this community. So you can't sense it. You wouldn't know that it's here, and that's why people probably are shocked by the existence of facilities like this in their community. Another feature of ethylene oxide is it's fairly persistent in ambient air. It lasts for several months in the atmosphere before it's degraded. So that another reason of its accumulation then in the environment. So some of the health effects, there's more details than I can summarize here, and Dr. Geller might talk a bit more specifically about some of the medical issues. But what we look at then is what are the effects of high exposure? And much of this information we glean from occupational studies of workers who have been exposed in the workplace related mainly to either the manufacture of ethylene oxide or users in the gas sterilization and medical sterilization operations. And so either some of the effects we've seen from those studies that separate out the acute or the immediate effects of exposure, that can be neurological effects related to that exposure, also some of the GI effects related to nausea and vomiting. But also for those who are in direct contact, you can actually get frostbite from direct contact with ethylene oxide gas. We also look at some of the long-term or chronic effects of exposure. And I'll also be related to neurological effects, reproductive effects. But what we're most concerned about, though, in communities like this, is the effect on cancer. And that's based on a large-scale NIOSH study that was conducted a few years ago, looking at over 18,000 workers in the sterilization industry, both men and women, and some of the effects that were observed in those studies of those workers. And they found that elevated incidence of mortality of specific lymphoid cancers, we refer to them as, that includes non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, myeloma, and lymphocytic leukemia, as indications of the effect of exposure to ethylene oxide in the workplace. And also was observed an increase in incidence of breast cancer in women. So we use that information then to define what is the risk at lower levels. These are occupational levels at very high levels. We're now assessing the risk of exposure to lower concentrations that we find in communities where these facilities are operating. So at this point, I'm summarizing some of the work that's, the groundwork that's being done here is currently we do not have the data sufficient enough to address or to evaluate health risk in the community. It's mentioned about modeling data that is being developed to assess that in a theoretical risk. But we also feel that, and this is why we're supportive of the efforts that have been described for monitoring in the community to measure the actual concentrations that people are exposed to. And as part of that assessment then is to work closely with partner agencies, the Georgia Department of Public Health, local agencies, as part of that assessment. John Wheeler is my counterpart here in Region 4, and he'll be leading his staff in conducting that assessment in that partnership. And so when that air sampling data is available, then we will assess that, provide that information in a document for public comment. We'll be making conclusions about our findings about the level of health threat to the community and also specific recommendations for actions to be taken to reduce that exposure. And again, our goal is really to be protective of the public, to be preventive of further exposures as appropriate. And we have contact information you may have seen in the open house, information sheets about our agency and how you can contact them. But John Wheeler would be a point of contact for you, and also Sue Castile is also part of the original staff. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Sherry Drenzik. I work for the Georgia Department of Public Health. I'm the state epidemiologist here in Georgia, and I'm also your neighbor. I live in 30339, and it's a great pleasure to be here with you tonight. So what I would like to talk about in my brief remarks, and I'm going to shorten them from some of the slides that I actually had initially started with in the interest of time, is as we talk about cancer risk and the modeling of cancer risk, that there may be an elevation in cancer risk, what about the actual cancer data? How do we know actually the number of cancer cases that we see in the areas of concern? And in order to talk about that tonight, I want to talk a little bit about how we do cancer surveillance in Georgia. So first of all, just as part of our mission in the Department of Public Health, we are tasked with, and our mission is to monitor and protect the health of our communities. And one of the key ways that we do that is by conducting disease surveillance. What that really means is that we collect, analyze, and interpret health-related data in order to identify patterns of disease occurrence in our communities, and then use that information for either additional investigation or for action for prevention and control. So when we're talking about cancer, how do we do surveillance for cancer in Georgia? Cancer actually is what is considered to be a reportable or notifiable disease in Georgia. It is reportable by law to us at the Department of Public Health. So physicians, hospitals, laboratories, pathologists, and other facilities are required by law to report every single diagnosis of cancer to us at the Department of Public Health. Well, how do we do that? And how do we collect the data and maintain it? We have established a Georgia Comprehensive Cancer Registry for a number of years now, which is our system for collecting and analyzing these data. The Georgia Cancer Registry was established in the beginning of 1995, and so has been in existence since then. And the healthcare providers and hospitals that report cancer cases to us actually report them electronically through an electronic standardized system. But then there's a lot of data follow-up that goes in afterwards. So again, cancer registrars in hospitals and some of our epidemiologists and DPH staff go in and collect additional information from the medical record. And we really track individuals with cancer from the time they're diagnosed, all the way through their first course of treatment. And cancer, by law, is not reportable to us, again, immediately. It takes a number of months, and by the time we collect additional data through the course of treatment, it may be at least a year or more until our kind of cancer data for a given calendar year are complete. So I just wanted to give you a sense that it's not like instantaneous real-time data. It requires, again, a period of time to collect the entire year's worth of data. So how good are these data in Georgia? Actually, CDC, again, set some standards for us, and we in the Georgia Cancer Registry are part of a whole national system of cancer registries. We have agreements with other state registries to share cases, for example, that may be Georgia residents diagnosed in other states. And we work very closely with, again, the entire network of cancer registries in order to, again, submit to CDC national cancer data as well. The data quality for our cancer registry data here in Georgia are very, very, very good. CDC sets standards for completeness, timeliness, and accuracy of these data, and they're evaluated by an organization and awarded either, sort of gold, silver, or bronze status. I'm really proud to tell you here in Georgia that our cancer registry has been awarded the gold status for data accuracy for 17 years in a row. And again, so we can say that if we're using these data to inform action, they really reflect reality. We can be confident in these data. We're one of 22 out of the whole 50 cancer registries of distinction. So I'm proud to say that. So what do we actually do with these data? So we look at trends over time. We can calculate incidence rates for cancer for both the state as a whole, for individual counties. And we use these data to inform cancer control and prevention programs. We share these data with public, policymakers, decision makers, and we also actually, again, can use our cancer registry data to respond to inquiries, about given situations where we want to identify patterns of cancer occurrence or high-risk areas. Often in times, we receive these inquiries from the public, and again, so if we're thinking about the situation that we're all here about tonight, and we think about our current inquiry into our cancer data and our cancer registry data, the question is there evidence so far of an increased cancer incidence in the area or areas surrounding the Sterigenics facility of concern? So again, when we look at this type of analysis of cancer data, it's a very systematic process that we go through in a very defined way, where we very specifically, sort of define the area of risk, define the time frame that we're interested in, calculate incidence rates in these areas for all cancers, and then the cancers of interest that may be related to ethylene oxide exposure. And again, when we looking at our initial data analysis, so we again just began this process as well. We at the Georgia Department of Public Health began looking at cancer data, just within the last several weeks in response to this event. And we decided to look at available data preliminarily, looking at zip code data. And as you've heard from my colleagues that presented prior to me, it is known that the ethylene oxide emissions really do not travel farther than a mile. So if you're looking at a whole zip code, again, it may not accurately reflect risk or a given area of risk. So we need to drill down further. But when we looked at zip code, just initially, we looked at the 6 zip codes surrounding and adjacent to the facility. And we actually did not see on the zip code level, any evidence of increased incidence of cancers as a whole, or the cancers of interest that have known to be associated with ethylene oxide. And again, this is preliminary data. Again, it may be reassuring to us, but it's only the first step. It's really important for us to look beyond that as the preliminary analysis and drill down further into our next steps. So what we really want to do in order to determine with certainty and with scientific accuracy, accurately reflecting risk, let's look at a small area around the facility, a mile radius around the facility, or the census tract is maybe as a little bit bigger area. So we're going to drill down into these more refined analyses. And again, these were the standard ways that were approached in the Illinois study, and also in Colorado with these similar facilities, and to do the analysis of their cancer data. We are just beginning that with support from our ATSDR partners. We're urgently working on this to try to, again, get the best information possible in these small areas. It requires a whole different methodology, and it takes a little bit of time. Again, it's not something that we will, have available for you tomorrow. But again, we will, again, be diligently and urgently working on these analyses, and we look very forward to being able to share this information with you so that we can indeed inform action and make decisions based on science. And I'd like to thank you very much for your kind attention.
Good evening. So first I want to thank everybody for being here. I think it's important that we hear from you, we hear your concerns, and for those that came by our table, we appreciate the dialogue we had. My name is Chris Rustin. I serve as the Interim Director of Health Protection for the Department of Public Health, and also serve as the Director of Environmental Health, so I wear 2 hats at the department. So what I'm going to briefly chat with you about is one of our smaller unknown programs at the Department of Public Health, and how we collaborate with ATSDR to assess risks within a community. This particular program is called our Chemical Hazards Program, and for environmental health, it sits within that section. You probably know us as the health inspectors. Most of our environmental health staff, if you go in restaurants, if you go to swimming pools, if you stay in hotels, it's that group that's doing those types of inspections. But we do have a small group called the Chemical Hazards Program, and this particular group, its sole mission is to focus on chemicals in the environment and to assess the risk of those particular chemicals and address concerns of human exposure. This particular program, and the reason we collaborate so closely with ATSDR is because we're funded by ATSDR. ATSDR funds 25 states around the nation to do health consultations and health assessments in collaboration with their agency. And so we work very closely with their agencies, and we ensure that we perform these assessments according to the guidelines as well as the strict protocols that are established. And so when it comes to ethylene oxide, we're going to be one of the agencies that's working extremely closely with their unit to assess this particular risk. So I'm going to, in the essence of time, move quickly through this. I just wanted to mention it's a small program. It's made up of 3 staff members. The 2 most important staff members for you guys is the environmental exposure assessors. This particular individual is the person that's going to be looking at the data, the actual sample data that's taken by the City of Smyrna, by Cobb County, as well as by Georgia EPD, and working with ATSDR to establish an actual risk of cancer within the community. With this particular collaboration, I think it's important, as been stated by ATSDR, is that we have to have data to be able to analyze this. And so we are also waiting on the sample data to be able to start this process. But once that data starts coming in, we'll be working very closely with them. And part of a health consultation will result in a study that will be published. And this particular study will be open for public comment. And so again, we want to continue that dialogue with you guys. But within this study, what we're going to look at is obviously the sample results, the environmental sample results. We're going to do a toxicological evaluation of those particular results, trying to establish what the actual risks are associated with real samples and not the model data in particular. We're going to focus on sensitive populations like the elderly and children. We're going to look at the maps, the geology, as well as the demographics in the area, the topography. Are there any intervention or mitigation measures that we can recommend to try to reduce potential exposures? And then lastly, there'll be conclusions and recommendations. So this report will be forthcoming as the data starts coming in. ATSDR, as mentioned earlier, will be the lead for this, but we'll be working hand in hand through the Department of Public Health to assist them with this particular study. And as I mentioned, I'm kind of repeating myself here, but I think it's important to know that our scientists at the department are going to work closely with writing this particular assessment. And when it's published, we're going to be looking for the feedback from the public. That helps us refine the study. There may be things that we didn't think about when we published this particular report. So it's going to be very important that this group is as engaged in the future as you guys are now to give us that feedback that's absolutely necessary. And then lastly, we'll be working closely with our cancer epidemiology to assist them with the cancer incident assessments, which does help inform this particular health consultation that's going to be conducted. This is our website as well as an email address that you can send information to. You can go to this particular website. And if you have questions, by all means, please give us a call. We're happy to answer questions. And now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Geller with the pay suit.
Thank you. So, my name is Dr. Robert Geller. I am a pediatrician and medical toxicologist. I'm employed by Emory University, and I've been doing this a very long time. As stated, we are an independent agency. We are funded, part of Emory University. We are funded for our time partly by EPA and partly by ATSDR, but we are independent of them, so they disclaim any responsibilities for anything I tell you after this. So our mission statement is to provide an independent source of information and education to professionals and to community members regarding the effects of environmental exposures of all kinds on women and children and women of childbearing age. And we have been doing this at Emory since 2000. So first of all, a couple of things I want to remind you. Toxicology of ethylene oxide 101. First of all, it doesn't stay in the body a long time. It stays in its half-life, which means half the value of half the amount in your body is removed from your body by your liver primarily, partly by your lungs, within 45 to 60 minutes. What that means is, if you were to go take a sample of any kind, it's going to tell you what was there or what was absorbed principally in the last 8 hours at the most. So it's not going to tell you what you've had, and there's no time weighting value. So it's not going to be a terribly predictive measure. We'll talk about that further. Secondly, absorption to ethylene oxide is primarily by inhalation. It is absorbed somewhat by skin contact if you were to get it on your skin, but it's primarily a gas, so it's not easily going to get on your skin. So this is the same data you've seen from a couple of previous speakers. So I want to summarize this differently. I want to tell you that the dose makes the poison. If you want to think of it this way, very simplistically, you want to drink water, but you don't want to get drowned if the water filled this room and you couldn't get out of it. Water is good for you in low quantities. We think it's a good thing, but it's not terribly good if you get swept up in the flood. So that's a very simplistic and perhaps rude and crude example, but basically the dose makes the poison. In the occupational setting that we're talking about with acute data, the dose the workers were exposed to is between 10 times and 10,000 times the dose you're talking about in the air. 10 times to 10,000 times as high. The, quote, chronic low-level exposures that we talk about are, again, at levels far above those that we're talking about inhaling in the air. So what do we have then in terms of health effects from low-level exposures that we're talking about in the air? We're not going to say that they're good. We want to eliminate them as much as we can. But the reality is you're seeing two things. You're seeing that if you were previously exposed at a very high level, you might have an allergic response when presented with a very low level. The second thing we're seeing is that there is an increased risk of cancer. That risk of cancer probably increases with the intensity of the exposure and the length of time you're exposed to it. Therefore, children are likely to be more sensitive more affected over a period of time because they live a longer period of time and they're exposed for more years. It's not necessarily that they're magically different, but you have this longer exposure time. Also, particularly young children under the age of 1 or 2 breathe much faster and consume more air. Why is that true? Because they're growing faster. If you think about this, children triple their birth weight between the age of birth and 1 year of age. If we tripled our weight every year, it would be a very sad story. So in order to support that incredible growth rate, they need more oxygen, which means they breathe more air. Anything that's in the air comes in as well. So because of that, young children are particularly more sensitive than adults. So I've heard some comments about the question of what happens to ethylene oxide once it gets in the body. Well, first of all, it conjugates with a chemical that's present normally in your body. So conjugates is a medical term that says that it physically bonds to that compound to form a new chemical, if you will. And that glutathione is present in everyone's body because it's present to deal with all sorts of chemical threats. Just to give you an example, glutathione is what saves you if you take a small overdose of acetaminophen, and what gets overwhelmed if you don't have enough glutathione. Acetaminophen becomes poisonous. So it's present in all sorts of settings that we talk about. Okay, ethylene glycol, ethylene oxide, is primarily metabolized by your liver to ethylene glycol. Ethylene glycol is known to you primarily as antifreeze because it's the primary ingredient of most car antifreezes. But the level that's produced is less than 0.001%. That's no decimal point error there. Less than 0.001% of the level required to produce ethylene glycol toxicity. So that is essentially, for our purposes, a non-toxic metabolite. So in closing, I want to acknowledge the authorship of the fact sheet that we gave you and of some of the slides from Region 5 PACU when Chicago dealt with this last year. And I want to thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer questions. If there are questions we haven't answered during this meeting, we're happy to take your input and try and answer them for you. Thank you.
Okay, so we have a number of health questions that folks submitted, and we want to get to as many as we can. So, first question. A lot of people have questions on other effects besides some of the ones that were listed up there. So, for example, is there information suggesting that ethylene oxide causes birth defects, types of birth, or autism? Besides being a cancer agent, is ethylene oxide known to cause skin conditions, breathing problems, change in a person's DNA, cataracts, other potential effects?
Based on the information we have from the 18,000 workers studied, plus the other information that's published in the literature, in short, the answer is you have to have much higher levels to get any acute effects or chronic effects than the levels present in the air, even in the worst situation we're talking about in the United States. I notice I said in the United States. I'm willing to go that far. We have to get much worse than that. So I'd say the answer is no. If you're talking about the effects of the much higher levels we said occur in the workplace, there is data about increased risk of spontaneous abortions. There is no data about birth defects or other effects on kids.
A lot of questions around children and pregnant women. So first of all, folks want to know if there are studies or research being done related to ethylene oxide in children, or any that are planned. Should we be concerned about children playing outside? Right? What are risks for pregnant women and children? So essentially wanting to know specifically about pregnancy in children and risks of playing outside, et cetera.
Okay, so let me answer those two questions, and I'm going to pass on the question of what research is being done. That's not my field. So the first question is, the levels that we have in the air are not high enough not anywhere near high enough to cause effects on women or children, pregnancy or not. My expectation is that your cancer risk is increased based on the amount of exposure you have over your lifespan, but over the amount of time that you're playing, there are all sorts of competing effects, and the benefits of being outside, the benefits of not being cooped up inside, the benefits of the question of how much better is your air inside than outside, which I can't answer. So is being inside any better than being outside? Hard question to answer. So I am not of the opinion that you should keep your kids inside. I am of the opinion you should keep your kids inside when you have bad air quality. When the bad air quality in Atlanta, let's face it, is primarily driven by things like ozone and diesel emissions and other motor vehicle things. And not to say that we shouldn't reduce our exposure to ETO as much as we can. I am in favor of reducing it as much as we feasibly can. But when you say what are the effects and trade-offs of staying inside or moving to Montana or Wyoming or whatever, you're making a bunch of lifestyle choices when you do that. And I suspect I tell you that your health care outside in Atlanta is probably better than in rural Montana or rural Wyoming, and so you might have trade-offs there. I can't speak to the answer of what research is being done. Perhaps one of my colleagues can.
Anyone?
Yeah, I don't have any specific information about ongoing studies, but I can certainly indicate that the attention that's being brought to bear on the exposures in communities from these types of facilities certainly has an impact in making that a priority. Now, I mentioned our agency has a toxicological profile, which is essentially a comprehensive review of all of the scientific literature. And I think once we have that completed, we'll identify where there are some gaps in our understanding about health effects. That may then lead to strategies then to address those gaps through further research.
Okay, thanks. There are a number of questions that were around weather impacts and how that interacts with ethylene oxide. So I'll just read a handful. So how long does ethylene oxide stay in the air and how does it leave? Is it accurate that rain washes ethylene oxide from the atmosphere? Does ethylene oxide go up in the atmosphere? Is it dense enough to linger on the ground? Is there a seasonal correlation with the risk of ethylene oxide? So, for example, might summer heat increase exposure or prolong ethylene oxide dissipation, leading to greater risks? So folks want to know kind of about water, about heat, about anything we can say about kind of physical characteristics and how it interacts with weather.
I don't think we have enough information to know about seasonal variability, but we do know that ethylene oxide reacts very quickly with water vapors, so we would expect that that would probably be undergoing what's called hydrolysis, where, as Dr. Geller mentioned, the formation of ethylene glycol is a common byproduct of the interaction of water with ethylene oxide. So it might be reduced in the air under high vapor concentrations or on rain events, but then it would be then replenished with as new emissions come in and new sources that are fill that gap. So it would be a somewhat transient reduction resulting from that.
Okay, thanks. So last question for the health panel, then I think we'll bring the last panel up. Some folks are just interested, what should they do if they're concerned about exposure, right? So should they be doing medical screenings, or should they do certain things to add to their medical routines if they're worried about having been exposed?
Okay, so I really wanted to talk about that. So I told you before that the half-life of the compound is short in the body. What that means is if you get a level, it reflects your exposure probably over the last 6 to 8 hours at most. So then we have to say, well, how does that reflect to what was happening in the air, what you did in the last 6 to 8 hours? Were the workers having, if you're worried about saying it came from the plant X, were the workers having a seminar today and they weren't producing it? So you tended to get a level and it's low and we don't know what that means. Or conversely, you got a high level, but does it mean that something else happened that day that was different? So it's not going to be a terribly predictive number. And then we don't know what to do with the number anyway. So you get a number of n, and I don't know what to tell you that means. Does that mean that n plus 1 is a lot worse? Or that it has to be n plus 20 that's a lot worse? And so my answer to you is that's not a terribly useful pursuit of getting a sample of any kind at this point from your body. I think our goal, if we're going to spend money as a society, we're going to spend effort, it should be reducing emissions in the first place, rather than measuring what's in your body right now. And so if I was going to spend my tax money or my personal money, it would be on reducing exposures rather than on getting samples from anybody. Now, having said that, the next question is, so, gee, I'm worried about X. I'm worried about getting A, B, C, D, E, F, G, Y. I don't care. I don't think the likelihood of anything is high enough that I know of to say that spending money to go test, I want to get a yearly, I want to get a daily CT scan of my chest because I might get lung cancer. I want to get a weekly test of XYZ. I don't think any of that's terribly helpful. And so I think you should talk to your personal physician about that. But if they asked me, I would vote for nothing particular in terms of medical monitoring.
Okay. You want to add something, Chris, please?
So I think one of the questions was, what can you guys do to help us? Once this health consultation is published, it will be open for public comment. We encourage you to read the health consultation and provide comments back to us, because that's what helps us come to a final conclusion with this particular report when it is ultimately published. And this information will be communicated with the community when it's available for public comment.
Where should people look for that when it's going to be ready to be communicated? On your website? Yeah. Where should they look for information about when that's out?
So I know in the past, and I may let Mark speak to this, ATSDR typically creates a website when they do health consultations. I'm not sure if they're going to do that in this particular setting, but that particular website is shared with the community, and that's where updates are provided, and ultimately the document will be provided for public comment.
Okay.
Yeah, a couple of points. So I agree with Dr. Geller's point about making sure that we focus our attention and resources on preventing exposure by eliminating emissions. However, in the meantime, there are some tools that we're exploring to see how we might be able to better characterize exposure in communities beyond just air monitoring. So one of the tools that's being used in occupational studies is to measure what are called ethylene oxide adducts. These are the reaction of ethylene oxide that's absorbed into your body and its interaction with both DNA and causing mutations, but also interaction with proteins in your body. And one of what's called the biomarkers of exposure to ethylene oxide is the formation of a covalent or irreversible bond of ethylene oxide with hemoglobin in your red blood cells. And measuring those levels of ethylene oxide hemoglobin adducts can be a measure of your exposure over several months because your red blood cell lasts for about 120 days. So one of the tools that we're exploring, and this is work that Dr. Geller put up a slide of Dr. Susan Buchanan at the PACE-U in Region 5, is involved in a pilot project to look at people who've been exposed to ethylene oxide in communities like this and measuring their ethylene oxide adducts in their blood as an indication of their exposure that gives us more information about that that we currently do not have. The other point is that people who smoke have a higher level of ethylene oxide adducts in their blood because of its presence in tobacco smoke. Also, children who live in homes where they're smoking might be more exposed because of that. So we're also using this tool as a comparison to a national data set, since CDC also measures this in the blood of over 2,000 people over across the country. So we'll have a better idea of how the level of exposure in communities like this compare to how people are exposed to other sources of ethylene oxide in their daily life.
Mark, can you speak to, is that commercially available or is that a research project? Do you want to clarify that?
Thank you very much. Yes, it is a research project. You can't go to your doctor and say, I want this test done. It is very much a research, and that's why we're characterizing it as a pilot project that helps us characterize this more closely. And so it's not something that can be done as a routine test.
All right, thank you. Let's give a round of applause for our health panel. So we're now going to welcome up back to the stage Ken Mitchell from EPA Region 4. He's going to talk about EPA rulemaking and other efforts moving forward. And Karen Hayes is going to talk about next steps on Sterigenics and more broadly. So I would just say these next set of presentations are going to be very quick, but the purpose here is to let you know what's happening and what are opportunities for you to influence that, okay? So you can actually influence this rulemaking process, for example. So this is important stuff. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ken.
So, hello again. I just want to take a couple of minutes here to tell you some of the things that are happening in the near future, right now and in the near future. So as you've heard already, we have several rules that are out there that require different kinds of industries to reduce or to limit their emissions. And one of those rules is for commercial sterilizers. There's another set of rules that go for chemical manufacturing plants that make and use ethylene oxide. And so we're right now reviewing those rules. For the sterilizers, we have folks that are looking at our current rules to see if there are opportunities for further legal emission reductions. And we expect to have a proposal out on that in the very near future. And I don't know exactly how that's going to work, but the way it typically works is that we have a proposed rule that comes out, and then we have a public comment period where folks can read what we're proposing and provide comments back on our proposal. And we'll welcome your comments on it when it comes out. And then once the comment period is over, we review those comments and then write a final rule taking into account the comments that we get. And then once the rule is final, if it requires anything more than what is currently required, the companies that the rule would apply to will have a period of time to between the finalization and some time in the not too distant future to install any additional controls that are required. So that's typically how it works. And so please do keep, and we will let you know if you've left us with your email address, we'll make sure that you know when this proposed rule comes out so that you can read it and comment on it, because we'd like to hear from you. For the chemical manufacturing facilities that use ethylene oxide, it's the same process. We expect our proposal for those types of facilities out in the near future. We actually are under a court order to have the final rule for that one done by March of 2020. So that's definitely going on. And then nationally, we're also continue to gather information on industrial emissions of ethylene oxide. And in some of those facilities, we're doing testing and whatnot. So the point of all this is that because this has come up in the NADA, and we see that there are potential issues around the country, we have a very focused effort to try and understand this better, look for ways to reduce emissions, and then implement those through rules or through other voluntary programs. So, and then the last thing that I wanted to mention is that I mentioned when I was up here before that we're seeing ethylene oxide in samples in places where we might not expect to find it and at some elevated levels. So that is an important question for us to figure out. Is this something that is kind of everywhere in America and we just didn't know it? Is it only in certain places? But more importantly, what's causing it? Where are these concentrations coming from? And what can we do to reduce those concentrations? So there's a big effort going on right now to try and evaluate those background concentrations. And in Georgia, here, what the federal EPA is doing is we're working with our partner at Georgia EPD. We're consulting with them on their upcoming monitoring and any additional modeling studies, and then working with them to evaluate those results. And then the last thing that, the other thing that we're doing here at EPA Region 4 is making sure that going forward we have very strong opportunities for a continued conversation with you all. So we have, as a first step, we've set up a website for this, which I think many of you have gone to, and we have an email box where if you haven't gotten an answer to your question or you think of a new one, we want to hear from you. And so please send your question to that email box. And then we'll be posting answers to questions on this website going forward. So that's the other big piece, is we want to make sure that we have a good conversation with you and keep you informed and hear from you as we go forward. So that's what we're doing at Federal EPA, and now Kieran's going to come up and talk about some of the things that they're doing at Georgia EPD.
Okay, and start with our next steps with regard to monitoring. So last Friday, Georgia EPD announced plans to conduct monitoring for ethylene oxide near these facilities. We're going to monitor near the BD Covington facility as well as the Sterigenics Cobb County facility. We will also continue to conduct monitoring at our South DeKalb monitoring site, develop some of that background information, and get a better understanding of what other sources might be out there. And we will be monitoring at a rural site in South Georgia as well to get a better understanding of what ethylene oxide emission concentrations might be at a very rural area with no mobile source emissions, no industrial source emissions. So the monitoring done by Georgia EPD will be samples. They're taken over a 24-hour period. It'll be on varying days of the week. It'll be a long-term study. This will go on for months, not weeks. We are ordering the sampling equipment right now, expect to have it out in the field early October, have sampling results early November. Those sampling results be posted on our website when we receive them. Website is on the Georgia EPD website. There's a special link to ethylene oxide information. So we'll be sampling in 4 quadrants around the facility, upwind and downwind. starting out a quarter mile away and then moving further away, a half mile, 1 mile. And depending on the information we have, we may adjust the monitoring protocol. And so we'll also be sharing the monitoring data with Georgia Public Health and ATSDR, as well as I said, putting it on the website. So with regard to permitting, Sterigenics has already submitted their permit application. We are processing that right now. The permit application shows additional air pollution control equipment that will significantly reduce the emissions from this facility. When that new permit is issued, it will contain additional monitoring requirements, stack testing requirements, annual reporting of ethylene oxide emissions, and also a cap on ethylene oxide emissions. And so the permit application is available on our website. If anyone wants to submit comments on the application, they can be submitted to askepd@dnr.georgia.gov, and that information is on our website. You don't have to write it down. So once the new permit is issued, those requirements will be required. They'll be enforceable, no longer voluntary. So the permit will require additional stack testing. We will be on site for that stack testing. A third party will conduct the stack testing, and the results will be analyzed by a third-party lab. And then when EPA finishes their revision of the ethylene oxide rule that applies to this facility, if additional controls are required, we will put them in the air quality permit for Sterigenics. So other next steps is there's other sources of ethylene oxide in Georgia, and we're reaching out to them now, conducting the same modeling study that we talked about earlier with them. And if necessary, we will work to get additional reductions at those facilities as well.
Okay, so we're up against time. I just want to ask essentially a quick question to you folks that definitely came up. If the air monitoring suggests that the ambient levels of ethylene oxide are significantly higher than was expected and above what we would see just based on background, right? What might happen in that case, right? If we do this monitoring, it turns out that there's a lot more of this stuff in the air, and it really seems like it's coming from the plant. What's going to happen?
So, well, of course, all of our hope is that that is not the case, because we don't want any folks exposed to high levels. So, the thing that I encourage us all to do is to let's work through this process, take the samples, see what we find. All evidence at the moment points to us not finding really high levels, other than possibly what's kind of there anyway from background. But if there are very excessively high levels, we at EPA would have a conversation with our co-regulator, Georgia EPD, to look at what the available legal means are for us to address those in short order. But again, as I said, I'm not expecting that to be the case, but we will cross that bridge if we come to it.
Yeah, and I would reiterate, I think we all hope that that is not the case, but if we do see levels that are unacceptably high, we're going to have to go back to the company and get additional reductions.
Thank you. Okay, thank you both. So thank our final panelists. Just a few more words on next steps we're going to talk about. You guys are free to go. Thank you. So just a few words to wrap up. So opportunities to get answers, provide input. So you all had a chance to talk with folks during today's open house. There's also the EPA website that was mentioned. We're going to be posting the slides from today up on that website in the future. So if you want to dig into them and really get that information, that'll be there. We're going to be posting a meeting summary about the answers that were provided today and the nature of the presentations that you heard. And as we've been telling you throughout the evening, those questions that we couldn't answer, we're going to have an FAQ up on the EPA website that's going to address them. So if you didn't hear your question today, and I know there were a couple from the community group that I really wish we had a chance to talk about, but we'll be getting answers to you on those. So stay tuned for that. And also, if you want updates, right, you can sign up. There's that sheet that was up there earlier, and I believe we'll be leaving that open as folks leave if they want to add their name to the list and get updates coming from EPA. There's the email that was mentioned, to email directly, and I believe that goes to Ken, who's been up here, and another colleague of his in the region who's been involved in this event as well. And also there are webinars that you can go on EPA if you want to learn more. So in particular, the rulemaking process, if folks want to learn about how to engage and make comments effectively, there's a webinar on that. There's also webinars on air toxics and the basics of risk assessment, so those are good resources if you want to learn how to be an effective advocate. Okay, so with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues, Rick Dunn from Georgia EPD and Mary Walker from Region 4, and you guys can go in whatever order you prefer.
Well, I actually think Toby said a lot of what I wanted to say, but first, good evening again. I do want to thank you all for your participation tonight and for the thoughtful questions you sent in. I won't reiterate our webpage or the fact that we're going to have information posted. I do want to note that when the proposed rules come out, they will be out for public comment. So please, this is an opportunity for you to engage when those rules come out for public comment. I hope you can see tonight that we actually strove to take your most representative questions and your toughest questions, but I do want to acknowledge that there was not infinite time, and so we will work to get all the information and the answers to your questions on our website. And then lastly, I just want to, in closing, convey that we at EPA have heard you. We know you're concerned. We take this very seriously. I personally will convey to my colleagues at headquarters, as we go forward with our national effort to address ethylene oxide more broadly, your concerns, because we take your health, we take our air quality very seriously. So thank you again to Commissioner Ott for hosting us here tonight. Thanks to our leaders for being here and for being engaged on this. And thank you all for your participation. It's much appreciated.
I'll just be very brief. I just want to say thank you to everyone who was here tonight. We appreciate your time and your attention and your interest. Thank you to Commissioner Ott and our other leaders as well. We didn't have any slides, EPD, but just our website is epd.georgia.gov. There is a link there for ethylene oxide information, and we'll do our very best to put all of the relevant information that we have available on that site. So thank you, and Toby, I'll say goodnight and let Toby wrap it up.
All right, just want to thank folks again for all your input, your questions, your attention, really just being a fantastic audience. You guys have really listened. I can tell you're engaged, and we need that, right? We need you guys to stay engaged, keep trying to work with your officials, and move forward to address these problems. All right, so thanks so much.